Hi, I'm Christina and this is a book review of Restless Dolly Maunder by Kate Grenville. So this is the third book that I've read from the Women's Prize for Fiction Longlist this year. This one is a historical fiction novel and it was published in 2023. Our main character is called Dolly and it is set in New South Wales in Australia. It spans quite a long period of time. It starts in 1881 and it ends around 1950. So when we first meet Dolly, she is a child and she lives on a farm in Australia with her mum and her dad and her siblings. And we see her through her early childhood, we see her going to school, we see the dreams that she has for her life. We see her first relationships with men, we see her eventually get married and have children, and we also see her professional life and everything she chooses to do as a career in her lifetime. So I will say that I did enjoy this book. I'm giving this one 3 stars. I went back and forth on whether it was like a high 3-star read or like a low 4-star read, and I think I'm settling with a high 3-star read. I enjoyed this one. I enjoyed the characters, but there were times when it was a little bit more boring for me. So around halfway through, I found it a little bit dull, a little bit monotonous, and I was getting a little bit bored. But I do think, having read the end of the book, that is partly what it was meant to be. It's meant to show that sometimes in life, parts are a little bit dull, a little bit monotonous, a little bit the same. And I just think that reading her life from start to finish, there were times when it wasn't as interesting as perhaps it could be, but I did enjoy seeing her throughout her life and seeing her relationships with her family, with some of the men in her life, with her children. I think it was an interesting story and I was very interested to see where it was going to go. As well, it touches on some really important periods in history. So obviously it starts in 1881. We go through World War One, we go through the Great Depression, and we also go through World War Two. And I would just say that I thought those historical events might be kind of more fully explored in this story. I feel like we did kind of just touch upon the historical events and kind of looked how that affected Dolly's life immediately, rather than looking at it on a kind of grander scale as maybe how it affected Australia as a whole or the world as a whole. So I was kind of, when we got to those periods in history, like when we got to the start of World War One, I thought there was going to be a lot more time spent on World War One, for example, and the Great Depression, for example, because we kind of hit that period in history, and when we were going through the years, I knew it was coming because obviously I could see what years we're getting close to, and yet it was kind of more superficially touched upon, I would say, rather than fully explored. Obviously everything is through Dolly's perspective. We are seeing her life through her eyes, and some of these massive historical events didn't impact her life so much, so we didn't really see it all that much. But I would have liked to have seen a little bit more and learnt a little bit more what it would have been like for people living in Australia during these time periods. I feel like I didn't learn loads about that, and I think I would think about that slightly more because when I was reading The 8 Lives of the Century-Old Trickster, which is set in North Korea and South Korea, and it follows similar periods of time. We follow the World Wars, the Korean War, and I learned so much about living in that country during those time periods, and it encouraged me to do so much raw reading around the subject. And I feel like I learned a lot from that book, and it was a historical fiction novel where I actually learned history, whereas this one is a historical fiction novel and I wouldn't say that I learned anything about history at all from this one. It felt like it just kind of glided over the historical events rather than really kind of knuckling down and looking into them, which is more what I was hoping for. I think when I read historical fiction novels, I love to come away having learned something about that period in time, about those people, about the culture, about anything at all. If I can come away from a historical fiction novel having learned something about a period in history that I didn't know that much about, or even if it's one that I do know about and I can learn some more, I love that. That's what I really get enjoyment from when I read historical fiction. So for me, that was something that was a little bit underwhelming, I would say. And also there was times, like I said before, especially during the middle, it was a little bit dull at times, a little bit boring, so I think I'm going to settle on a 3-star read, just because when I rated the 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster 4 stars, I did get so much more enjoyment from that one. So yes, I enjoyed it. I do think it's worth a read. One thing I will say is near the end, there is a photograph, a real photograph. And after this part, I really enjoyed the book a lot more. So I was just going through the motions. I was enjoying it, but I knew it wasn't going to be a new favourite read. I just wanted to see what was going to happen to Dolly and her children and her grandchildren. And I wanted to see where we were going to end, for example, obviously, because we were going throughout history. And then there's one part when you get to this photograph of this woman, and I found this very interesting and very touching and quite moving, actually. And I will say that the last few pages of the book with the photograph really made this book feel a lot more poignant, and it did kind of make me feel a little bit emotional at times. So throughout the story, I would say that I wasn't emotionally connected to the character of Dolly, or particularly to any of the other characters at all. I was enjoying reading about them, but there was no emotional connection. I didn't think this book was going to be hard-hitting for me because I just didn't have that connection to the characters or the story. Whereas when we got to the part with the photograph and the explanation, it did feel more hard-hitting to me, and it did kind of add some gravitas to this story. And I really feel like I know why she wrote this book now, which I really liked. I was kind of asking myself the question, do I wish that was at the beginning of the book? And I think the answer is yes. So I don't want to say what it is, because obviously it is at the very end of the book, and I don't want to go into spoiler territory, because it really added something to the story when I read it this way. So obviously I'd read the story and then I read that, and it added something to it for me, so I don't want to take that away from you. But in the sense that, had that been in the beginning of the story, if I would have gone into the story knowing that, I think I would have already had the emotional connection, and then I think the book overall might have been harder hitting for me, and I might have, I feel like I got more from this book in the last few pages, just literally a couple of pages, maybe 4 or 5 pages, than I did in like the previous 230 or so pages. So that's just one thing I would mention, that had that been in the beginning of the story, I think I would have gone into this with a completely different perspective on the whole story. So yes, that is my thoughts on this one. In terms on the Women's Prize for Fiction Longlist, this is the 3rd book that I have read. So the first one I read was 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster, and I really enjoyed that one. So far out of the 3 that I've read, that has definitely been my favourite. And then I think with this one, the other one I read was Soldier Sailor. I think I would tie both of those books together. I have it right here. I think these two would then be tied for 2nd place. But for me personally, yes, 8 Lives of a Century-Old Trickster is definitely my favourite out of these 3. I just got so much from that story, and I was very emotionally connected, and I did learn so much as well. I do have a book review video for both of those books, so I will link those down below, just in case you'd like to hear my full thoughts on them. But yes, I enjoyed it. I would recommend it. It isn't one I would say wish out and get necessarily, but if you are interested in reading it, then definitely do. It is a good read, and it has a lovely connection at the end that I think you will appreciate, because I certainly did. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. Please do like the video if you've liked it, and please do subscribe if you'd like to hear more of me talking about books and hear more of my thoughts on more books from the Women's Prize for Fiction Longlist. See you in my next one.